China and Iran have just openly defied Donald Trump, and they did it in a way that no one in Washington saw coming. They have activated a new large-scale railway route to move all of Iran's oil, completely circumventing the United States naval blockade. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a workaround, not a temporary patch, a full strategic pivot that rewrites the rules of this confrontation. If this kind of serious, unfiltered geopolitical analysis is what you are looking for, I invite you to subscribe to this channel right now. Turn on the notification bell so you do not miss a single video. And let me know in the comments what country you are watching from. Whether that is Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Spain, the United States, or any corner of the world. I genuinely want to know where you are joining me from. If you find this analysis valuable, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to understand what is truly happening on the global geopolitical stage. If the dilemma was the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is now saying, do not worry. I will deliver the oil to China by train. And if you want to blow up a Chinese train passing through our rails, well, that is a matter between you and Beijing. I will acknowledge with complete candor that this is changing everything in the geopolitical landscape. While American warships sit idle, waiting to see what they can intercept in the Persian Gulf, Iran is moving its oil to China by rail. The visual contrast alone is staggering. A superpower's navy anchored in frustration, while freight trains quietly carry crude oil across Central Asia. That image, my friends, is one that strategic planners in Washington ought to find deeply instructive. 37 Iranian vessels have reportedly been intercepted, and yet, trains are already loading crude at refineries in southern Iran and heading directly toward Central Asia. From there, the oil continues by rail into China. This is the first time Iran has used this railway corridor as a large-scale export route, and China has agreed to play its part. One must concede that this is a move of considerable audacity, executed with a pragmatic efficiency that reflects how seriously both nations have studied American pressure, tactics, and devised their countermeasures over decades. The railway is the masterstroke that Iran and China have just executed together, and it represents a challenge of brutal proportions to American strategic dominance in the region. On Karg Island, the petroleum heart of Iran, responsible for the vast majority of the country's oil exports, the onshore storage tanks are no longer keeping pace. The naval blockade is preventing tankers from leaving the island. And yet, Iran continues pumping crude at a rate of approximately 1 million barrels per day. In other words, Iran is capitalizing on this situation in ways that no strategist in Washington anticipated with sufficient seriousness. There is a lesson here. A lesson about the persistent and costly tendency of American policymakers to underestimate the adaptive ingenuity of adversaries who have been living under maximum pressure for decades. Nations under prolonged siege develop muscles that comfortable powers do not even know exist. Above all, the price of crude oil is rising. I am not suggesting that Iran is not suffering. It is. I am not suggesting that war is desirable. It is not. But Iran found a way to challenge the United States alongside China, and it is doing so with remarkable resourcefulness. What precisely are they doing? They are storing the surplus production in ordinary cargo containers, in whatever vessel or receptacle can physically hold petroleum under pressure. I have reviewed American sources, not Iranian ones, and what those sources reveal is striking. Iran is loading oil into rusted scrap containers in Bandar Abbas and Asaluye. They have reactivated a 30-year-old tanker, the Nasha, and are using it as a floating warehouse, all to avoid halting production entirely. And now comes the question that truly matters, and that most mainstream coverage is completely failing to explain. Why the urgency? Why not simply wait out the blockade, reduce production temporarily, and resume when conditions improve? The reason is technical, but it is historically consequential. If Iran shuts down its water injection wells, water will penetrate the petroleum-bearing rock, permanently trapping the crude inside the formation. Iran would lose that extraction capacity forever. Not temporarily, forever. That is why Iran prefers storing oil in industrial dumps and on rusting tankers, rather than compromising its productive capacity irreversibly. That, my friends, is not a symbolic gesture. It is a carefully calculated decision, with global economic consequences of the first order. It reflects exactly the kind of long-term thinking that short-term political pressure campaigns routinely fail to anticipate, and it is precisely why those campaigns so often produce the opposite of their intended results. Let me proceed with the analysis in layers, because this situation has several geopolitical dimensions that each deserve serious attention. The first is China's strategy. As a longtime observer of global energy markets and American foreign policy, I have come to the conclusion that China is simultaneously the largest buyer of Iranian oil and the largest oil importer in the entire world. Iran, for its part, has China as its principal customer, its economic lifeline. Even though that relationship has operated for years in the shadows of formal diplomacy, beneath the surface of official communiques and carefully worded statements of non-intervention, the reality has always been clear to those willing to look. For years, Iran and China operated under a sweeping 25-year strategic cooperation agreement, a deal I have always regarded less as a conventional commercial treaty and more as a mutual survival alliance forged in the heat of Western pressure. China obtains Iranian crude at a significant discount. In exchange, it invests in Iranian infrastructure and provides goods that Tehran cannot obtain from the West due to sanctions. But that is not the whole story. The relationship has evolved into something considerably more strategic and more intimate than a mere buyer-seller arrangement. And that evolution has accelerated precisely because American pressure gave both nations every incentive to deepen their interdependence. China is now telling Iran, "What do you need? Drones, cruise missiles, ammunition, electronic components? Whatever you need." China is providing it, because both sides have extremely valuable assets to exchange. One has unmatched industrial capacity and military technology. The other has oil, a great deal of oil, and now also a railway it is using to move that oil with an effectiveness that no one in Washington expected. The exchange is transactional on the surface, but strategic at its core. And it is exactly the kind of alliance that emerges when the world's dominant power overreaches with blunt instruments and fails to leave its adversaries any face-saving exit. Now, the corridor itself. This is not new infrastructure. It is called the North-South Corridor, and what it does is connect the Persian Gulf with the Caspian Sea. From the Caspian Sea, a body of water strategically dominated by Russia, the route continues into Central Asia, and from there into Western China. What is new, what is historically significant, is that this corridor is now being used to move Iranian oil at scale, bypassing the Persian Gulf entirely. I have been watching with growing attention the role of the Caspian Sea, its strategic implications, and how it has become a central element in this confrontation. Whoever controls the Caspian Sea at this moment controls a critical global supply route. It was not always so. Now it has become exactly that. Iran historically moved all of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. It was the most convenient route, and from there the crude went, not to the world in general because of sanctions, but certainly to China. Now faced with the American naval blockade, Iran is effectively saying, "Do whatever you want. My oil will move." And with this, China is telling Washington with total clarity, "Your blockade does not interest me. It does not stop me." That is a message with implications far beyond the current conflict. It is a message about the limits of American naval power in a world where overland infrastructure is rapidly maturing. The second layer of this analysis is the timeline, because all of this is unfolding with extraordinary speed. On April 13th, naval interceptions began. In barely 2 weeks, 37 vessels had already been diverted. Iran, for its part, confirmed that it confiscated 2 oil tankers, one of French origin, one Panamanian. Many of those vessels were sailing under flags that do not belong to them, the so-called flag of convenience, in an attempt to evade detection. The Strait of Hormuz went from processing roughly 140 vessels per day to barely 5. That, my friends, is a near-total strangulation of commercial traffic through one of the world's most vital maritime choke points. What is evident is that Iran has not yielded. On the contrary, it is escalating, with methods that Washington did not anticipate. The railway, I venture to say, is one of them. The Caspian Sea is another. And the question that no one in the corridors of power seems willing to answer aloud is this: will the United States dare to carry this confrontation to the Caspian Sea? Because carrying a war to the Caspian Sea means, in practical terms, carrying it to the doorstep of Russia. And that means a potential conflict with Russia as well. The consequences of that scenario should give any statesman with a genuine sense of historical responsibility serious pause. And yet I hear far too little sober reckoning with that possibility in our public discourse. The third layer of this geopolitical analysis is the time factor. Based on my observations, the remaining capacity in the onshore tanks on Karg Island will be exhausted in less than 2 weeks. When that threshold is crossed, Iran will face 3, and only 3, options. The first is to halt production entirely, because it has more oil than it can move, at the risk of causing permanent, irreversible damage to the oil wells. This would also affect the rest of the world by removing a significant volume of Iranian supply from an already stressed global market. Prices spike. Everyone pays. The second option is to escalate militarily in an attempt to break the naval blockade by force and restore the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. That would mean a return to open war with the United States. And that appears to be precisely the outcome the Trump administration is attempting to provoke through this sustained pressure campaign. The blockade structure is deliberately designed to make this option tempting. Iran maintains a blockade on Persian Gulf countries from the north. The United States maintains a second blockade from the south. If you cannot pass and no one passes, the strait is effectively closed for all practical purposes of Iranian energy commerce. The third option is to continue using trains, reactivated tankers, and improvised storage, the path Iran has already chosen. All 3 options are bad, but the third is the least catastrophic in the short term, and that is precisely why Iran is taking it. Now, this is crucial, because oil is not something abstract for any of us. It does not matter that you are watching from the other side of the planet. Oil is what drives the price of gasoline, diesel, plastics, fertilizers, and ultimately our food. The connection between a tanker blockade in the Persian Gulf and the cost of filling your vehicle at a gas station in the American Midwest or in suburban Buenos Aires is direct, measurable, and very real. If Iran manages to keep its production flowing, even with improvised methods, global markets will receive contradictory and deeply unsettling signals. On one hand, crude will keep flowing. On the other, the channels will be fragile, expensive, and unreliable. And here is a distinction that must be stated clearly. The railway cannot replace oil tankers. A single train can carry only a fraction of what a single tanker ship moves. So while what Iran is doing is genuinely ingenious and strategically significant, the actual volume being exported through the rail route remains minimal. That is an important distinction between symbolic defiance and genuine strategic success. Nevertheless, and this asymmetry matters enormously, Iran is moving its oil. We cannot say the same of the Persian Gulf countries. They are not moving a single drop, not a single barrel through the strait. That asymmetry tells us something important about who is absorbing the greater immediate cost of this confrontation. When 2 countries of this significance openly challenge the dominant superpower, financial markets become very nervous. Strategic oil reserves, crude futures contracts, ship insurers, all of that will begin recalculating their risks. We have already seen what happens when this kind of uncertainty takes hold. And if this tension continues and escalates, it is very likely that filling a gas tank will cost 3 times what it cost before this conflict began, without exception. For those watching from Mexico, Canada, the United States, Colombia, Argentina, or anywhere in the world, no one is insulated from the consequences of a disrupted global energy market. There is something more that few are saying openly, and it is this. The American blockade has not achieved its principal stated objective. The Trump administration declared that its goal was to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. But what the blockade is achieving in practice is a more creative Iran, an Iran more willing to align deeply with China, and an Iran more resistant than ever to capitulating to external pressure. And in the end, Iran found its way to move crude. Not as much as it should, not through the channels it prefers, but it found the way. I have argued for years that unilateral American sanctions rarely work as intended. This case offers yet another illustration of exactly why that is true. Sanctions, at their best, are a tool of gradual pressure within a broader diplomatic strategy. At their worst, they are a substitute for strategy, a way of appearing decisive while avoiding the harder and more uncomfortable work of negotiation and coalition building. What I observe in this case is that the pressure has driven Iran and China closer together, made Tehran more inventive, and demonstrated to the rest of the world that the American financial and commercial system can be routed around with sufficient determination and the right partners. That is not a victory for American interests by any reasonable measure. Iran's adaptation is remarkable from a purely strategic standpoint. This morning, I was reading about an attack Iran carried out using an F-5 aircraft. Not an F-16, not an F-18, not an F-35, an F-5. An aircraft of another era, long considered obsolete, and it worked. There is something deeply instructive in that fact, something that speaks to the danger of assuming that technological superiority automatically translates into strategic advantage. In an asymmetric conflict without clear front lines, ingenuity and desperation can be far more powerful than the most advanced hardware. We are going to see railway accidents, crude oil spills, naval confrontations. If an Iranian vessel attempts to force the blockade by moving through the strait, that is the moment when war will erupt again. And at that point, we will no longer be talking about energy policy. We will be talking about the very real possibility of a conflict of regional or even global dimensions. The escalation ladder in this theater has very few rungs between the current state of affairs and a confrontation that no responsible leader should want. We are in a countdown. Within 3 weeks, the tension is going to reach a critical threshold. And not only in Iran. What is happening to Iran is also happening to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, and to Qatar. This is not exclusive to Iran. But what truly worries Washington in private is that China is gaining influence across the entire region, not only with Iran, but also with Oman, with Iraq, and with all the countries that are now quietly reconsidering their geopolitical alignments. There are other nations with access to the Caspian Sea, and they could reach the same conclusion. Send oil to China rather than leave it unsold, rather than shipping it to a Western world that increasingly looks like an unreliable partner. That would represent a fundamental reconfiguration of the global energy market, a change with historic consequences, and I fear that no one in Washington is thinking with sufficient depth about that scenario or its long-term implications for American influence in the region and beyond. What we are witnessing is not a crisis that will be resolved in days or weeks. This is a structural change in how oil moves around the world, and potentially a structural change in the alliances that shape that movement. Iran is demonstrating that a country under blockade does not necessarily capitulate because the United States wishes it to. It contorts, it adapts, it finds alternative channels, and it does so with a resourcefulness that repeated rounds of sanctions have only sharpened. China is demonstrating that it is willing to challenge the United States directly, in a manner that no administration in Washington fully expected to see so openly and so persistently. The White House maintains its blockade, but it has not managed to paralyze Iran's wells, which was ultimately what it sought. The result on the board is a war of attrition. We shall see who blinks first. History suggests the answer is rarely as obvious in advance as the architects of pressure campaigns would like to believe. The old tanker Nasha, which had been rusting for 3 decades, now floats off. Karg Island full of crude, that image alone strikes me as a powerful metaphor for this entire confrontation. A vessel once thought to be finished, obsolete, irrelevant, pressed back into service by necessity and ingenuity. It is not an unfamiliar story in the history of nations that refuse to be broken. Tell me in the comments what you think, and which of these 3 options you believe Iran will ultimately take in the coming weeks. I read every one of your responses with genuine attention and genuine interest. This is the kind of analysis that major media outlets do not always provide, but it is the unvarnished reality of what is occurring. Subscribe, share, and let's keep watching together.